So in the last video, we've talked about the overall how this program is going to run. Now, this time we're going to focus on this part, which is to convert the components into a V7 version 7 compatible components. Okay, so again, as we said last time, when we saw this icon, we can show the sub steps. Okay. So actually, these sub steps shows that there are multiple components to make, including the process flow diagram, are called PFDs, and then in which we're going to add, for example, the EG tree nodes for the programs. Okay, and then we're going to have to add the components for the code task, for shortcut to files, for nodes, for EG task, and lastly for the links. So I always put the link for the last because you have to have those individual components first. Then you're going to link that to the individual components. All right. So as I said, I call that a component because first. So it is not only to contain to add one tag. You're going to add a bunch of tags and their children nodes or whatever. All right. So this is the first. The second is that you're going to add multiple elements in different places. Some will be in elements. Some will be in like process view, tree view. So there are multiple elements to be added for each component. So I'm just going to take one typical one, which is to add the code task components. So again here, so we can view the code for this function here, this module here, which is called convert task V8 to V7. Okay. So inside we have subfolders, substeps. We can bring up the substeps, which is to like the first one is that we are gonna get all the code task elements from that V version 8 DOM. So remember, this is the version 8 DOM. This is the source with all the source data, and we are gonna get all the code task elements from this DOM. And then we're gonna get the input. For example, how many code task, and for each one, what is the label, what is the ID, where to place it. For example, this the kind of things we're gonna make that into a input array, right? So with this input array, then we're gonna loop for, because this input array is an array of the input for each individual tasks. So one task will be an element in that array with all the settings for that task. For example, the ID, username, whatever. Okay. So with this, then we have this array, and then we're going to loop for this array to get the configuration of each individual task, and then we're going to make and append the task components into the target version 7 DOM object. All right, so that's the whole process of how it is done. Well, I'm going to skip all of these step 1 and 2, basically just to get the DOMs and to make task import. I'm gonna go to this the third one, which is to loop into to add the task components. So these steps are actually defined here because it is repeatedly used a function. So in this part, so if I go to these functions for making V7 EDP components, you will see that corresponding to those components, so there are there are nodes specifically for each of the component. For example, so this is a big map. So for example, here I said I want to loop for each task array and add the task components. And you can see that actually it is linked to this task component. All right, so that's how it works out. Let's just take another example. For example, for this one, so I'm going to show the sub-steps. With this one is to make the shortcut to file components. And again, this one is going to link to this shortcut file to components. All right, so that's how it is linked. So now we're going to go back to this task and making the task components. So following this link in this D3 diagram, I'm going to go to this task components, and then I can expand it, and it's going to show me that actually there are two things to do here. The first is to config the tasks. Okay, so again, so you can see that for this one, the code is stated there. But what are the things to config? So first it is going to config an element called element. All right. So that's why I'd rather call it component, because element has a special meaning for the SAS project.xml. So basically, the element means a component here. Unfortunately, it is called element. And within this element, there are another element. All right. So why it is called the element again? Because this one is to define the properties of this element. For example, the label name, the ID, the type, the parent container, when it is created, by whom. So all of that is defined here. Okay. So by the way, so for most of these components, there's always going to be a sub or a child node called element. All right. So within this element, so this element is going to be defined as it's kind of like the component. What I mean component here, all right? And within it is always going to be an element to define the properties. So I would say that this illustrated that so when developing this structure of the XML, I would say that it is not carefully considered, because it's kind of confusing for me. It's kind of confusing to me. All right. So anyway, so these are the things to be configured. So other than this element itself, so we have other parts that we need to configure, so that later we will know what elements should be adding to which part of the project.xml. So like for this code, for this task component, for example, we need to have an element, and that will be put into well, let's go back to this XML tree view. So this element will be defined, and then the elements itself will be injected into this elements part. Okay. So the next is the PDF file is the same story. It's going to put it somewhere else. For example, this EG tree node is going to be put into this external project, and then you go to this project tree view, and it's going to inject it somewhere inside. Right? So actually, it is quite complicated. So it should be inside this EGP, then the PFD EG tree node, and then within that, whatever. So it's quite complicated, but all of the settings are inside here, so that the program will know where to inject it. And the same for this task graphics, and the same for adding the code into that. Remember, into this zip file. So correspondingly, we will have this task ID. All right. So and we're gonna make a file called code.sas, and save the code there. All right, so the way of treating the manually created SAS code and the code converted from version 8 is a little bit different. So here, this part is to deal with the manually created code. So for those code from the SAS version 8 file, we're going to do it in the next part, which is called the make append task components. So first I'm going to collapse this sentence to make it easier to read, and I'm going to enlarge it. Okay, so let's go back to this one. So remember we said for the task components there are two parts. The first is this configure task function. So we have to configure it. So let's just go back a little bit again to recap the process. All right, so the process is that we're going to read from the version 8 file. And then we're going to have all the so this part is done here. All right, so the next is that we are going to loop from this V8 components. We're going to read the configuration and data there, and we're going to put that into an array called the task input array. So each element in this array is the configuration for an individual task. All right, so with that, then we're going to loop for each task and add the components. So remember that here we have this task input array, which is with all the settings in version 8. This is called a task input array. All right, so it's very important to understand. The second is that we're going to create another array, which is called configure task. All right, so the difference between this input array and this task config is that this input array is simpler. But for this configure of this task is more complicated. It is really to mimic the structure that we're going to have in that XML file. So for example, if a property is within this elements, then element, and then element again, and label here, then most probably for this task configuration, it is going to called element.element.label. All right. So this is to make it easier to make the real components into this XML file. But it's more complicated. The structure is more complicated. Whereas this make task input array is simpler, despite the contents are the same. So basically, this configuration step is to read the data from the simplified input array and then translate it into a more complicated structure, which is mimicking the structure of the XML file. Okay, so that's how it is done. All right, so now let's carry on. So with this configurations, the next is that we can make and append the task components. And again, here we can show the sub steps of that. And basically, it's gonna, for this one, it's gonna make multiple elements. The first is that it's gonna so this is for the task, but before that we already made the process flow components. And for this task, the complicated thing is that we have to inject something, which is the idea of this task, into the project flow component. So this part basically is going to do this, right? So the next is that it's going to append an element, which is let's just go back to this structure again. So basically, it is going to insert a task element into this part, this element part. Okay. So then the next is that we're gonna make an append that the EG tree node into the EG tree node part, which is to define the EG tree, which is in this extra object and within this project flow EGP, and then we're going to add EG tree here. Okay, and then after that we're going to insert the task graphics, which is to insert the task graphic into here. All right, so into here. All right, this is for one single task. These are the things to do. And finally, we have to add the SAS code into the zip file. Right. So for this final zip, we're gonna make a folder using the task ID. Inside it, we're gonna make a file called the CodeTask with the code we had from the configuration. All right. So again, as I said, so because there is so we can, for example, we can go into the sub-steps of this function, and we will see that actually for this one to make elements, which is, just to recap, it is the to inject in task elements here. All right. So we're going to take two steps. The first is that we're going to make this component according to the configuration we have above, right? And the second is that we're going to append that to the elements. Well, again, for this part, it has sub-steps. All right, so we can go to the sub-steps, and basically it says that, well, so there are three things to do. The first is that you're going to read the prototype XML. Remember that earlier we said that we have these proto XML files, which contains the basic structures for each part of this XML file, right? So with that, and then we're gonna clean the XML file because some of the prototype is with comments, and we're gonna clean that, for example. And then the next is that we're gonna configure this components, which is to apply the configuration we have to customize that particular prototype file. All right. So in this case, for making the element, we're going to configure the element part of that, which is the ID, lab, label, type, whatever. So this is the first, and then after that, we're also gonna determine whether this task is with embedded code, which is the code from which is saved in version 8 file or not. So if it is embedded, then we're just going to copy that, which the code is already in this function. So otherwise, we're going to make a DNA part, and basically this is more complicated. We're gonna run this function called the make DNA to make it, which is again to read a prototype file, a DNA file from this list, right? So read this structure, then clean it up, then customize that. All right. So and after that, so we're going to change that into HTML. So specifically for this part, I just want to go back and highlight the special the things, which is that in this case we're going to insert some HTML code instead of a DOM node here. So I'm just going to go back and take this example. This is a simpler example, and you will see that in this file, for example, in this DNA node, so actually there are some code which are with it sounds like it's different. It does not have a tag sign. Instead, it has this ampersand symbols here. So this has a special meaning for SAS EG. because the purpose here is that SASVG is going to read this part and convert that this part as the HTML or XML code within this DNA, and it's going to treat that separately. It's going to make an individual XML file out of this code, right? So, and then after that, it's going to know that, okay, so this part is to define, for example, this part is to define the location of the file, right? So, so why it has to be like that? So imagine that if this one is made into this this XML code, this just like the rest of the code with the sign, so the code here, then Sask won't recognize this part specifically for the location, for example. So it's gonna instead it's gonna put that into this project XML as an additional node inside, and which is gonna cause error. So the other example is, I think it is the note. Yeah. So let's go to the note. So you see that this is a note, and in this note, you have the text, right? And in this note text, it is also going to have sometimes like A. If A is greater than B, then it's going to have a sign like a tag sign, all right? So in this case, it's going to cause error, right? Because when SAS read this XML, if there is a, for example, for example, there is a less than sign, it's going to treat that as part of the tag, and it's going to cause error, all right? So that's why that for those texts that SAS does not want to make that part of the XML, it is going to change it to this ampersand symbols. And that's why it has a special meaning here. So parts like this, like here and also in those making the node components. So we have to be careful, and we have to make that into the HTML code. So the difference between making that into HTML code is that it's gonna change this less than signs, the greater than signs into ampersand symbols, so that to be differentiated from the XML tag code. Well, so the other is that just like before, that when we have a function sign here, so either, we're gonna have a link, and that link is gonna go to the function code and make the NN component, and then the details are going to be there. So that's how it works out, right? So here the point is that when making an individual component, it is always like that. So it always follow the same steps. So the first is to read the prototype XML. And then it's going to clean it up, and then it's going to configure that. All right. So after configuration, then we're gonna make it. So configuration of that. All right. So when this is done, then this component is made, and the next is that we're gonna append it into the specific location. And that's how this whole program is made. So the whole program is very complicated, but the principles behind that is more or less like that.